ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له إلها واحدا أحدا فردا صمدا حيا قيوما نؤمن له بالربوبية ونقر له بالعبودية من يهد الله فهو المهتدي ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا ونشهد أن سيدنا محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك وترحم على محمد وآل محمد كما صليت وسلمت وباركت وترحمت على إبراهيم وآل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد وصل اللهم وسلم على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين والشهداء والصالحين وعترة نبيك الطاهرين عباد الله أوصيكم ونفسي بتقوى الله عز وجل. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. قال الله في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولا تقولوا لمن يقتل في سبيل الله أموات بل أحياء ولكن لا تشعرون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. Today I'd like to talk to you about the concept of standing on the shoulders of giants. And for those of you who are not familiar with that phrase, it is a metaphor to mean that we use or we utilize the understanding of major thinkers and doers who came before us in order to progress intellectually into the future. And as we commemorate the days of Arba'een, as we reflect on the message and movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, I'd like to share with you a couple of points that we can reflect upon today. Number one, whether we know, recognize, value, like or not, there's no doubt that the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam changed the course of Islamic history and the history of mankind. Rarely do we as human beings recognize the accomplishments, the sacrifice, and the progress of those that came before us. But whether we recognize it or not has nothing to do with its validity. Human beings, as the Quran reminds us and asserts, what we know pales in comparison to what we don't know. One verse in the Quran says, وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِّنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا, that you've only been given a small portion, a tiny portion of knowledge of what actually exists and what's actually happening in the world. In another verse in Surah Yusuf, he also says, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ, above every person of knowledge, ذِي ilm or ذُو ilm, a person of knowledge, is a alim, the one who is most knowledgeable. Above every person who is aware, there is the one who is most aware. So what we have, or what we know in comparison to what we don't know, it pales in comparison to what we don't know. And this is especially the case for our lives when we assess where we are right now, when we look at our progress, whether it's intellectual progress, scientific progress, medical progress, social progress, and rarely do we recognize the accomplishments and the achievements of those who came before us in history. So, what I'd like to say is that in the case of Imam Hussain alayhi salam and company, and his family and his companions, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes them and those who follow in their footsteps with the following verse. And this is chapter number 2, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 154. وَلَا تَقُولُوا لِمَنْ يُقْتَلُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتٍ. Do not describe those who give their life in the way of Allah as dead. بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَشْعُرُونَ. Nay, verily they are alive, but you do not feel. You are not aware. You do not recognize it. So those that laid down their life, such as Imam Hussain and his companions and family members, they are not dead. The Quran asserts that they are alive. And because they are alive, they give us life, and they give the world life. So, I'd like to talk about today 3 aspects or 3 points concerning the movement of Imam Hussain. Number 1 is that the movement of Imam Hussain was built upon principles. Now, what are principles? Principles are foundational truths. Principles are truths that are timeless. What does that mean? That they're foundational truths, and that they are timeless, and that they are universal. Well, it means that whether you know, like, recognize, or value a principle, it applies. For instance, if I'm walking by the pool and I happen to slip and fall into the pool, once I slip, I'm at the mercy of gravity. Whether I recognize, like, acknowledge, or value gravity or not makes zero difference when it comes to suffering the consequences. It's not like I'm not going to get wet because I don't believe in gravity. So whether I throw myself, whether I dive into the pool or I trip over, doesn't make a difference, because now I'm subject to the laws of gravity. Principles work the same way. It's like gravity. Whether you like it, you value it, you acknowledge it or not, it still applies, and the consequences still apply. They're also universal. So whether I'm in the United States, or I'm in Russia, or I'm in China, or anywhere else, gravity is gravity. In that same sense, principles are principles. They're something that it's solid, it's rooted. So when you base your behaviors, when you base your ideas in principles, you know they are rooted. And that's what Imam Hussain alayhi salam did. I'll give you a few examples. A principle, for instance, or rather, let's say values that are rooted in principles, because the difference between principles and values is this. Principles are like terrain, right? If you're in Southern California, there's a specific terrain here, right? There's mountains. You have some areas that are a valley. If you travel eastward, there's a desert. If you travel westward, you'll find the ocean. There's a certain terrain. I can't argue with that terrain. I can't walk into the ocean and expect the ocean not to be there. That's the same with principles. Principles are like terrain. You can't go against it and expect it not to apply. Values are like a map. The map is what helps you navigate the terrain. So when I have a map of Southern California, I know that if I travel in this direction, I'm going to be limited. I need to look at the road that's on the map. I need to follow the road that's on the map. So what most people have is they understand principles, but they don't really have the right values. They don't have the right map. And so what happens when you don't have the right map? You don't know how to navigate those principles. You don't know how to navigate that terrain. So values have to be rooted in principles. So I want to share with you a number of values that Imam Hussain alayhi salam believed in that were rooted in principles. And those principles were those foundational truths. Number 1, you've heard this, some of you have heard this, is the value of the law of sowing and reaping. What does that mean? That means you have to sow before you reap. You have to give before you receive. Imam Hussain alayhi salam was a giver. He did not necessarily expect something to happen in return. He gave not because of transaction. Most of us, when we give, it's out of a transactional mindset. We're expecting something to happen in return when we give. Versus sowing because it's the right thing to do. That's a value rooted in a principle. Imam Hussain was a giver regardless of what the outcome was going to be. In fact, to those people that he gave, most of them, he knew there was nothing that was going to really come out of it. And so the law of sowing and reaping, giving before you can receive. Most people, they want to receive before they ever give anything, and it doesn't really work that way. You know, when I was studying in the Islamic seminary, I remember the home that I was living in, and I've shared this story with some people. There was, you know, a small little garden out front, and there was a fig tree, and I took care of this fig tree as if my life depended on it because I wanted it to produce figs. And so I remember watering it, taking care of it, changing the soil, pruning it, whatever, bringing an expert to tell me exactly what to do. And year after year, it wouldn't give any figs until one year, finally, I left it alone. I came back 3 weeks later and it gave figs. So I was excited. I said, finally, I got it to the point where it can actually produce. I've sown enough where I can now reap. But the problem was it only gave figs one time. The year after that and the year after that, it didn't give anymore. And I was expecting this tree to give. Now, when I left, when I left that home, when I left that country, I remember speaking to a gentleman who I had given the keys to that home to, and he would check up on the house and the trees and whatnot. And I remember he would call me and he would say that the tree has gotten so big you won't even believe it. The tree has gotten so big. So I remember visiting, going back maybe 2 years later, and expecting to have this huge fig tree. When I entered into the house, the fig tree had not changed at all, not one bit. It was another tree in another portion of the garden that had grown to about 15 or 20 feet. That tree did not even exist when I left. But within a matter of 2 or 3 years, it had sprouted and it had grown about 15 or 20 feet. And I'm thinking to myself, this godforsaken fig tree that I've spent so much time taking care of like a baby is not producing what I want it to produce. And this tree that I didn't even know existed has grown to, 15 or 20 feet. And so sometimes when you plant a seed, you don't know if it's going to germinate or not. You don't know where it's going to germinate, but you do it because it's the right thing to do. This is a value that Imam Hussain ﷺ taught us. A few more values that I'd like to share with you that are rooted in the movement of Imam Hussain. So these are contrasts, bad and good, and I want to share them with you quickly. So bad, avoid facing harsh realities. Good, face harsh realities. Most people, what they try to do in their life is they avoid facing harsh realities. Even some, I was reading one time, even some CEOs of corporations, there was one CEO of a major corporation, and when people would bring him bad news, he would fire them on the spot. What does that tell you? That this is a person who doesn't have the emotional intelligence to receive criticism. They try to escape from harsh realities versus facing a harsh reality, embracing a harsh reality. And if we study the life of the Imam lived at a time where there were many harsh realities, but he didn't go in a cave and hide or hide in his home. He faced those harsh realities because he knew it was his responsibility. So in our life, my friends, are we avoiding harsh realities or do we face them head on? That's one value. Another value, again, this is a contrast, bad and good. Worry about appearing good versus worrying about achieving the goal. So many of us, we worry about our public image. That's not to say that you shouldn't care what other people think at all. I'm not saying become carefree. There's a difference between being carefree and having freedom. If you think about that, there's a difference between the concept of being carefree and not caring what anybody thinks versus having freedom of thought and freedom of expression. And many people mix the two realities. So instead of worrying about appearing good because of status, we're so attached to status and what other people think about us, we should worry about whether we are achieving our goals or not. That was Imam Hussain alayhi salam. To him, it didn't matter what the people said. It mattered that he committed to something and he stayed true to his word. Number 3, again, contrast. Make your decisions on the basis of first order consequences versus make your decisions on the basis of first, second, and third order consequences. What does that mean? When we think about consequences, sometimes we think about them in a simplistic view. That every action has a reaction. There's one consequence. Most of the time, though, whenever we make a decision, there is a first order consequence, there can be a second order consequence, and there can be a third order consequence. Such as what? If I make the decision that for breakfast, instead of eating something healthy, I'm going to have a big piece of chocolate cake. No judgment here. If you've done it, that's totally okay. The rules are off during pandemic. If you decide to do that, what would be the consequence? It's not just the first order of consequence. There's a first, second, and third order. The first order of consequences, you feel really good about yourself. You get that sugar rush, you get that sugar high. It tastes amazing, it's delicious. But then it's followed by a second order of consequence. You'll start to feel it in your stomach, in your gut. And then the third order of consequences, you're, generally not making healthy decisions for what you're consuming. So most of us, we just look at the first order of consequence. Is this going to feel good? Is this going to taste good? Am I going to feel good, wearing this, clothing item that I couldn't afford in the first place? Versus making decisions based off first, second, and third orders of consequence. So if you look at the life of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, how was he thinking? And we'll talk about that tonight. Is that it wasn't a short-term mindset. It wasn't a short-term decision. It was a long-term thinking. So 2 more values, again, contrasting bad and good. One, and this would be the 4th one, allowing pain to stand in the way of progress versus understanding how to manage pain to produce progress. Think about that. Most people, if they're on a journey and they're facing obstacles and it becomes painful, they allow the pain to stand in the way of progress. It hurts too much to continue. I can't handle this anymore. It's overwhelming. It's painful. Maybe not physically, but psychologically or emotionally, something can become painful. And that becomes a hindrance in the way of progress. Versus understanding how to manage pain to produce progress. If you find people who are progressing in their life, it's not that they do not feel any pain. It's not that they're completely numb. It's that they feel the pain, but they understand how to manage it to further their progress. Last but not least is, again, a contrast. Don't hold yourself and others accountable versus holding yourself and others accountable. We really like to hold other people accountable. A lot of us like to get into management mode where we hold other people accountable for the things that have happened in our life, the things that are happening, or maybe some of the things that are not happening, whether we're achieving our goals or not. We love to hold other people accountable. Rarely do we rarely do we hold ourselves accountable. And that's the definition of leadership, is when you hold yourself accountable. Imam Hussain alayhi salam was a man who saw himself first and foremost as responsible for the well-being of the world around him, rather than blaming. I mean, he could have said, look, Yazid's just a tyrant. Yazid he's just out of control. There's really nothing that I can do to tame him. He didn't take that approach. He knew that it was his responsibility, and that was clear in the statements that he made. So this is one aspect. Another aspect is that Imam Hussain alayhi salam, in his values, he taught and embodied limitlessness. What does that mean? Most of us, we constrict ourselves based off of self-imposed limitations. We believe certain things to be true that are false. We believe certain things to be false that are true about ourselves, about the world, about others around us, and about God. And so we limit ourselves rather than practicing and embracing limitlessness. So I want to share another statement with you, and I want you to think about this. It says, what you think is attainable, right? If I was to ask you, what is attainable in your life? What are you able to accomplish? What you think is attainable is just a function of what you know at the moment. Most people, they don't even know what their potential is, because all they know is what's happening at the moment right now. So what we think is attainable is a function of what we know at the moment. And again, that is a manifestation of short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. Imam Hussain alayhi salam taught us limitlessness, right? Even when it came to his sense of compassion and mercy, he was limitless in his compassion and mercy, meaning that he didn't reserve his love just for his inner circle. Even those that fought against him, he prayed for them. He prayed for their hidayah, their guidance. He prayed for their salvation. Sometimes that's the toughest thing to do, is to pray for people's salvation, the ones that are hurting us. So this is a second aspect. A third aspect, and we'll end with this, is Imam Hussain alayhi salam also taught us that group interest trumps self-interest. What's good for society? What's good for humanity? What's good for the community? What's good for the team? What's good for the congregation? Not just what's good for me or what makes sense to me or what I want to believe in. How does this idea manifest itself? When we place self-interest before group interest, I want to share with you something I read recently, and it describes atheists and misotheists. So who are misotheists? Misotheists are people who have what they suffer from is a form of egocentrism, when we place our ego at the center of the universe. What they do is that they make special effort not to see the world from any other perspective except for their own. So when they look at the suffering in the world, or maybe when they look at their own personal suffering and they blame God for that, or they deny the existence of God, in essence what they're doing is that they're making special effort to perceive this entire universe in all of its sophistication and complexity through their own eyes. Only their eyes. Meaning only their perspective matters. Only what interests them. Only what looks good or sounds good or feels good to them. Rather than looking at it from a more holistic, universal perspective. So placing group interest over self-interest. And it's like a picture, and these days, you know, photography and the technology that's associated with it is so sophisticated, right? You have pictures that are graded over how many pixels that they have, and the more pixels generally, the higher quality of picture. And so in that regard, as humanity, as human beings, we have one pixel where God has the whole picture. And so Imam Hussain, even though he was suffering, personally suffering, his family was suffering, his companions, his most beloved people were suffering, he didn't make it personal. It wasn't just about him. It was about what the world needed at that moment. And sometimes, you know, we can fall into that blind state of when we're not aware of what's going on around us. And so everything becomes about us rather than shifting our eyes onto the world around us. So these are a few points that Imam Hussain alayhi salam reminded us of their importance. And so Arba'in becomes a time where we recollect, where we remember, where we reflect on the movement of Imam Hussain. Something that was so powerful that our sixth Imam, Al-Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam, in one of these ziyaras that are attributed to him, he says, أشهد لقد اقشعرت لدمائكم أظلة العرش. I bear witness that the throne, the arsh, what we call the throne or the celestial realm, is shaken by the sight of your blood. That the blood of Imam Hussain that spilled on the land of Karbala shook the throne of God. Because it was, what he did was so meaningful, it was so powerful, it was so principle centered, it was so, it was rooted in the interests of humanity rather than in the interests of self. And for that, the memory of Imam Hussain alayhi salam lives in the hearts of believers. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to count us among those who visit and pay tribute to Imam Hussain alayhi salam and his family and companions. Even though many people had the intention of visiting, traveling there this year, because of travel restrictions, most people were not able to, but we ask God to count us among those who visit, who pay tribute, and to reward us with the highest reward. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ وَصَلُّوا عَلَى مُحَمَّدٍ وَآلِ مُحَمَّدٍ.